I've been thinking recently, I ought to review some more non-Disney movies. After all, I watch more stuff than just Disney, but where to start? The obvious answer, of course, could honestly be anything. But the best answer is definitely DreamWorks. One of the only other animation studios to make animated movies that can match even the best of Disney. One sad fact about Disney, though, is that most of their modern movies aren't as good as their older ones, which has put DreamWorks in a very good spot recently, especially when it comes to Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. I didn't really pay too much attention to this movie until it came out. Then suddenly, everybody started raving about it, so I thought, might as well see what all the fuss is about. I entered this movie as a different man than I am now. I have seen the magnificence it has to offer. For once, the critics were actually right. This is honestly one of the best animated movies I have ever seen, period. And in order to explain why, I need to start with the most obvious aspect, the animation. I'm not usually a fan of CGI animation. I think it looks very plain compared to traditionally drawn animation, and I find the ridiculous obsession with making everything look as realistic as possible completely misses the point of animation in the first place. So it's a good thing this movie is nothing like that. This is probably the best looking CGI animated movie I have ever seen. The only real competition is Into the Spider-Verse, and assumedly its sequels that haven't come out yet. The reason this movie manages to stick out compared to most other CGI movies, as well as just look better in general, is because it is designed to look like a traditional animation, despite being CGI. They even reduced the frame rate to match closer to traditional animation in several scenes. But furthermore, it looks like a painting. Seriously, the locations and backgrounds have this beautiful stylized look that mimics the brush strokes of a painting. The lighting is also not overly hyper-realistic, and instead focuses on bringing out a greater contrast between the colors on screen. This allows the movie to have a stunning, vibrant color scheme not found in almost any other CGI film. Another aspect of the animation that stood out to me was the characters' eyes. Because of the change in art style, all of the characters are given much bigger and more expressive eyes. I also noticed that they made sure to make the characters' eyes pop out a lot, much like they do in traditional animation. The eyes of a character are arguably the most important trait in expressing personality. It's the reason why VeggieTales was able to have such expressive characters despite them only having eyes and mouths. And on top of all that, the movie has amazing direction. There are just so many creative locations and shots used in this film. And this also carries over to the action scenes as well. All the battles and chases are well choreographed and exciting. It's pretty sad when a movie about talking cats with boots has better fight scenes than most modern superhero movies. Especially the final Puss in Boots versus Death battle at the end, which is truly stunning. Speaking of action, this movie is also extremely engaging and well-paced. I was never bored for even a second, and honestly, I was on the edge of my seat for the majority of the runtime, which is quite a rare feat in modern cinema. Anyways, that's enough with the visuals. The real meat of this movie comes in the form of its story and characters. But let's start with just how clever and consistent this movie is. The continuity is on point throughout. Almost every scene in this film is set up by an earlier one, like how Puss brags about never being touched by a blade, but then runs for his life when we see him get cut. Also, shoutouts to expert showing and not telling being used here. Or how about Perrito saying that he can help people as a therapy dog and he can calm people who rub his belly. And then he sort of ends up being right, as he later does calm Puss down and more or less throughout the movie gives him therapy, whether Puss realized it or not. And I love all the callbacks to the Shrek movies. They are all nice and subtle and not overplayed or forced in, but perfectly natural and a great way to tie back into the overall franchise without feeling like it's chained to what came before. And the next aspect this movie gets spot on is that it is exceptional at comedy. This is a surprisingly funny movie, and it sounds like a fairly mundane statement to say a movie is funny, but unfortunately not many recent movies are actually that funny. The comedy here, however, is written very cleverly, not quite Monsters, Inc. levels, but also not too far behind. One standout joke involves Discount Jiminy Cricket over here. When he shows up, he tries to convince the villain Jack Horner to give up his evil ways and do the right thing. But Jack Horner is so far gone that this guy just can't reason with him. Every scene with these two is priceless. And honestly, when he gets the last blow against Horner in the finale, I had a huge smile, since Horner basically ignored any and all good conscience, and ultimately, that meant he had to pay the price in the end. Speaking of Jack Horner, he is easily the highlight of this movie when it comes to comedy. You see, he simply doesn't care about anyone but himself, unless, of course, he has something to gain from them. Yet, simultaneously, he is so far gone that his reactions to the chaos he is creating are extremely mundane and unimpressed. He's basically pure evil. And when it comes to pure evil villains, the problem with most of them is that they are boring. However, having a pure evil villain can be, and indeed is, a good thing when written properly, since a pure evil villain can serve as a good example of the ultimate endpoint of just how bad you can get, thus allowing us, the viewer, to compare the evil of the villain to our flawed hero. Having a pure evil villain also allows other, more morally gray characters to stand out more. So, how can you have your cake of a pure evil villain and eat it too without it being boring? By swapping the cake for a pie, of course, and making the pure evil character a comedic character. And what's even better is that in this movie, they not only solve the problem of pure evil being boring, but further said pure evil by showing us just how desensitized to death Jack Horner actually is. Because the comedy and evil are so well combined here, we get a rare glimpse at a comedic villain that is also a genuine threat. But that's enough about Jack Horner. The actual real reason this movie is a masterpiece is because of its themes. That's usually the reason most movies are masterpieces. This movie is actually quite deep and has a lot of themes and layers to said themes. But the most important and central theme is the importance of valuing life. This theme is explored in different ways through all the characters. Firstly, we have Jack Horner, who doesn't value almost anything in life. Then there's Perrito, who values practically everything in life. Kitty Softpaws, who wants to value more in life. Goldie, who doesn't value what she already has. And Puss, who hasn't valued everything he has had up to this point. The primary focus is of course on Puss, but a significant amount of time is also spent on Goldilocks as well. Both of which are characters who don't value something about their life that has been there the whole time, though both of them don't value it in different ways. However, due to their refusal to acknowledge the value of what they have, they end up hurting others. Goldie hurts her family by treating them like they aren't a true family, and Puss hurts Kitty by not being there for her as a true friend due to his carelessness and selfish loner attitude. But the key to both of their problems comes in the form of Perrito. Now I'm sure you probably noticed the clear odd one out in the group of characters I mentioned. Perrito is the only character who doesn't have a lack of value in their life in any way. In fact, he is quite the opposite. Perrito has literally been treated like trash his entire life, and yet chooses to always see the good in life instead of the bad. And when his siblings tried to murder him, he is glad for the free sweater instead of holding a grudge. Puss and Kitty just think he's naive and stupid at first, but his hopeful positivity ends up being exactly what both of them needed. Puss learns that he can't keep living alone now that his life is nearing its end. If he only focuses on the negatives, he will never value what he has and only thinks of what he can lose. Perrito never had anything in his life, and yet he feels complete. But Puss, who thought he needed nothing, is incomplete because he saw no true value in anything. And if Perrito can still live his life to the fullest despite having nothing and being treated horribly his life, then Puss, who has always been adored by the public and believed he never needed anything in the first place, can as well. And Kitty learns if she never trusts anyone in the first place, then no one will ever trust her, and thus never become someone she can trust. She realizes her error only when she sees Puss put his trust in Perrito after he ran for his life. And ultimately, this makes her see that she has to let her guard down in order for Puss to let his down as well. And so, Perrito is probably the true hero of this story, as without him, none of the characters would have ever made it anywhere or become better in the end. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, we find Jack Horner, a character who has deliberately chosen to ignore any and all value in his life. Because he grew up spoiled, having everything a child could ever want, he never learned the importance of valuing that wealth. Instead, it caused him to value only the things he didn't have, and thus he only sees value in things that are inconsequential, leaving important things like, oh, I don't know, human life, as unimportant to him. While Jack Horner is clearly very far gone past the point of redemption at this point, he nonetheless represents a possible worst-case outcome for Puss if he doesn't learn the value of life either. And we can see from the beginning of the film that Puss doesn't really care about anyone but himself. Even when the citizens are in danger, his focus is on impressing people and looking cool, not saving them. He has chosen to live his life in the moment, always seeking new adventure. But his life of adventure seeking causes him to value each moment very little, and eventually his lonely life leads him to a great desire, a wish that will fix his problems and make his life complete. Unfortunately, that's almost exactly what Jack Horner wants as well, and Puss nearly falls victim to his desires, but thankfully, unlike Jack, he actually learns to change and value what he has. One thing I really like about Puss's character development is how gradual it is. There isn't some big scene where he suddenly realizes the error of his ways, but rather he slowly improves his perspective and personality slightly in each scene. It's actually quite impressive just how smooth his growth is. Puss starts the movie living carelessly, but that leads him to a life of fear instead. A fear that ends up controlling him until of course he meets Perrito. Near the beginning, Puss doesn't see the value of Perrito and believes his overly positive view of the world is ridiculous and cheesy. But what Puss doesn't realize is that Perrito is the solution to his problems. Eventually, Perrito's pure heart ends up rubbing off on Puss as he starts to realize the scope of his fears and how they are holding him back, but that Perrito doesn't have those fears, not because he is fearless, but because he chooses not to focus on the bad in life, but only the good. Puss's fears have caused him to hurt his friends and the cat he loved, and keeping everything to himself was only making things worse. Puss then admits his fear, and in doing so, he makes himself vulnerable. But it is this vulnerability that causes him to realize the importance of his friends, and that he actually needs them. And by admitting his fear, he is one step closer to overcoming it. But admitting your mistakes won't just erase them, you have to face them and choose to live above them. And Puss does that quite literally when he sees reflections of his past lives. In this moment, he is tempted to go back to who he was, as he remembers the fun of his hapless life. But because he's moved past that and admitted his flaws, he can no longer see himself the same way, and thus he rejects his past lives, as death reminds him where they ultimately led him. In the end, Puss realizes that he doesn't need more lives because they will only cause him to return to who he was, and now he no longer wants to be who he once was. He only came to acknowledge the value of his life by realizing it is almost over. He can no longer afford to be alone, and he doesn't want to be either. Additionally, by learning to value his own life and the companionship of others, he manages to fulfill Kitty's wish and thus fix her desire for more value in her life, the value of a true friend. Whilst Puss does learn to value his life more by understanding Perrito's perspective and acting less selfishly, that is not actually the main reason he changes. The true motivation for Puss changing is actually his fear. Normally, saying that a character acted in fear would be a bad thing, but this movie does something most other stories don't do. It shows us that fear can actually be a good thing. You see, Puss starts the movie living life without fear. He believes this is a good thing, but the problem is that life without fear leads to carelessness and reckless behavior, and it is the reason he lost his first 8 lives. He thought that not having fear made him braver and stronger, but in reality, it really just made him stupider. He thought that his extra lives allowed him the freedom from fear, but because he ignored his fears, he used up all his safety shields, and now there isn't anything to stop him from meeting his permanent end. His lack of fear was virtually no different from a lack of value for his first 8 lives, and because he didn't value those lives, he is now paranoid for his final life. It's like if you spent your entire life not caring what you did, only to wake up one day realizing you're now 40 and haven't done anything meaningful in your life. Suddenly, you wish you hadn't wasted all that time until now, because once you started to lose something that you took for granted, it starts to become more valuable. Unfortunately, this kind of mindset can also be unhealthy because it causes paranoia and stress, and unfortunately, Unfortunately, Puss falls victim to this, going from a life without fear to a life controlled by fear. But running from fear is just as bad as not having any at all, since it is only delaying the inevitable and choosing to ignore one's responsibility and the consequences they have on the world. The true solution, of course, lies in the middle. And honestly, I think the third Doctor put it best in this scene.
Courage isn't just a matter of not being frightened, you know?
What is it then?
It's being afraid and doing what you have to do anyway.
Puss spends the entire movie looking for a way to delay the inevitable, but giving himself more time won't make him value it more. The reason life is so valuable is because it is short and we only have one. Fear helps us to understand the value of life because it makes us care. When Puss's life flashes before his eyes at the beginning of the movie, he sees everything that he had, and only thinks about how he won't have it anymore. But when his life flashes before his eyes at the end of the film, he now sees what he had for what it truly is. A good life. It doesn't matter what he did or what he will do. His life was good and valuable, and once he accepts that, he doesn't need to live in fear, since he has conquered it. In accepting the inevitability of his fears, he learned to value what he had, and by valuing what he had, he overcame his fear. So technically, he needed fear to properly overcome his fear. Slightly confusing, but I think you get what I mean. Also, on a similar topic, Death. Let's talk about him. Death is a very interesting character in this movie. I think the best way to describe him would be as an antagonistic version of Jiminy Cricket. That probably sounds like a stupid comparison, but hear me out. Like Jiminy Cricket, Death isn't just a basic character like any other. He is also meant to represent an idea. In the same way that Jiminy Cricket represents our conscience, Death represents our fears and, of course, death itself as a concept. And also like Jiminy Cricket, his role in the movie has more to do with what he represents than how he interacts with the characters in a traditional way. You see, while technically a villain, in the sense that he's out to get Puss, Death isn't actually evil. How can he be evil after all? Death comes for everyone, good and bad. It's not like only bad people die. Death is a force of nature, the final point in life. The only reason Death is specifically out to get Puss in this movie is because Puss doesn't take him seriously. He treats death itself as a joke, laughing at the idea. If you think about it, Death hasn't come for Puss because he wants to teach him a lesson. It's because Puss was asking for him. Whenever someone is foolish, the phrase people will often use is, "they're looking for death." And that is exactly why Death has appeared before Puss, because whether he intended it or not, Puss was asking for him. But once you go looking for death, you had better be prepared for the consequences. Unfortunately, Puss only realizes too late how mortal he actually is. And now, he only sees death as the enemy, something to avoid at all costs. But the problem with constantly living in fear of your death is that you end up placing more importance on your death than your life. In the end, Puss is only able to beat death by showing him that life is more important to him. However, that is exactly the lesson Death wanted to teach Puss, and because killing him at this point would actually go against the idea of life being more important, by putting more importance on Puss's death, he chooses to leave, knowing that he succeeded even if Puss took all the fun out of it for him. Once we learn to accept the inevitability of death and instead focus on the value of our lives, as limited as they may be, we stop fearing death, because we have overcome that fear and chosen to face it with courage instead. In the end, I suppose the ultimate takeaway from this film is that everyone only has one life, but that life is immeasurably important and valuable, and we need to see the value in what we have, rather than focusing on what we've lost or don't have. A life spent wanting will never be happy or satisfied, but a life of acceptance will always be full. And now we've reached the part of the video where I bother you about liking and subscribing, and also be sure to leave a comment down below telling me what you think about this movie. And if you want to, you can follow me on social media, links in the description. If you want to support me even more than just watching my videos, then you can help me on Patreon. But before you go, make sure to check out whatever this video is. I'm not sure what it is, but it's probably a good one, or perhaps check out any of the other videos in this here playlist. And most importantly of all, always remember to be iconic.